All right. Let's start. So we ended the story then with that fulfilled prophecy about all these things that God said, and things truly have changed. But Vim came just as we started break and said, but what about Judah? Do we know already who the king now is? And remembered, Ahaziah died. Yehu killed him. And Athaliah, as far as we know, didn't have another son. But must have had another wife. Not wife, but her husband must have had another wife because there was another boy in the story. So what happened was this. When news came back to her that her son was killed up in the north by Yehu, she retaliated by killing off the entire family of David that she could lay her hands on. So up in the north, there's a massacre taking place. Ahab's family is being completely destroyed. Down in the south, there's another massacre happened. David's family is completely being destroyed by Athaliah. So it's literally two different spirits making war in two different kingdoms at the time. And as this happened, there was a maidservant in the palace who grabbed a baby boy called Joash and made a run for the temple, probably thinking very cleverly, the temple is the last place that Athaliah ever want to set her feet. She doesn't care for worshiping the Lord. It was still a small baby, and for the next 6 years, this baby boy is hidden by Jehoiada, the priest in the temple. And for those 6 years then, Athaliah is on the throne of Judah. Who has Athaliah? Hey? Oh no, that's wrong. Yes, it must be 6. So you can put it up with a 6. And there she is reigning for the next years. And this boy being hidden in the temple is an absolute secret. An absolute secret. Because if you would know it, it's in the same city. It's right there. Here's the temple. There's the palace. He would have died. And now came the moment that Jehoiada and the rest of the priests decided it's time to put him on the throne. He's old enough to take responsibility. He's only 7 years old at that time. But this is enough. Athaliah needs to go. But how are you going to do it? Right? She runs the country. She has the command of the army and all of that. And so it was very, very careful planning. And Jehoiada at the head of it, saying, this is how it's going to work. We're going to bring him out. We've got bodyguards all around him. You do not take your eyes off this boy. And then there are guards in certain places with the gates and the temple doors and everything. And we're going to bring him out. We're going to put him next to that pillar at the temple where the kings are always anointed. And we will declare him king. And so they carefully bring him out. And the shout goes out in the city. Here's a son of David. Here's a son of Jehoshaphat. We didn't know there was another one alive. And here he is being brought out and crowned as king. And Athaliah comes out of the palace, walks into the temple yard, and shouts out, treason, treason. And at Jehoiada's command, says, go take her down. And as she's running back to the palace, they kill her. And Joash is on the throne. Who's got Joash? It's a small piece of paper for a small little boy, 7 years old. But all the time that he is reigning, he has Jehoiada as the priest as his advisor. And as long as Jehoiada is alive, this boy really reigns well. He commands repairs of the temple. And while they're doing these repairs, you can think in the time of Athaliah and even of the boys before that, the temple must have been in quite disarray and probably greatly unused. And as they're fixing up parts of the temple, suddenly a guy discovers a book. And they bring the book to the king and say, well, we found a book in the temple. And they opened it up, and it's the law of Moses. What? How glorious is that? And a revival breaks out. And I think I made a big mistake. Because if I'm remembering, it wasn't Joash. Hey? Who was it, Rob? Who found the book? It was Hezekiah, Manasseh. It was after Manasseh, I think. I think it was Josiah. Josiah. Yes. See, too much lunch. It makes us the makar, eh? Josiah. It was in his years. I remember now because it's close to the end, there's this massive revival. And then it's the end of it. Yeah, so it was only repairs to the temple. Sorry. But fortunately, Shane is there. He can edit anything out for us.
So I sort of ask a question, like, to bring a 7-year-old child out, I mean, what proof did they have? Because they could have brought any child.
Good question.
I mean,
They must have seen somehow. Mm.
They would have known him
As a baby.
he was born when they were already in office. So they would have known the king's children. So it wasn't as though they brought some orphan along. Because they would have recognized him.
Yeah. Good question. He looks very different there as the pup baby that they carried in there. Yeah. And here he is on the throne and he commands repairs. And as I said, as long as Jehoiada was alive, things went well. No, we'll get him right at the end. Thanks. And but towards the end, Jehoiada passes away. And as Jehoiada passes away, his heart starts changing. And Jehoiada had a son, Zechariah. In time, even Joash started worshipping at the Asherah poles. So turned away from the Lord. Now think about how incredibly sad this is. This is the Lord. Literally in the Lord's temple, his life was preserved. By a priest of the Lord, he was brought to the throne, to his rightful office. But he turned away from him. And then Zechariah at one stage came and brought a prophetic word and says, the Lord is warning you, you are turning away from him. And there will be consequences to that. And out of that offense, he conspired against Zechariah, against the very son of the man who spared his life and been his advisor all these years. And he had him killed. And whether their events are related or not, but shortly afterwards, Joash himself was assassinated. And it says, sadly, he was buried in the city, but not in the tombs of the kings. How tragic is that? This story should have ended very, very different. And we're going to see another refrain of this shortly in another king of Israel, of Judah, where pride starts coming in. And as the word says, pride comes before the fall. The pride of your heart deceives you. And when he was assassinated, then his son Amaziah came to the throne. And what I want us just to, for a moment, remember is, she's sort of a break in the chain. But just consider the absolute miracle of this line still continuing even through an event like this. Hey? This is God's promise all the way from David, still being fulfilled, still being fulfilled, still being fulfilled. It's God keeping the promise. At this moment, it's just so obvious that, man, if not for God, it would have been the end. And the promise would never have reached Jesus Christ, which is so much further. But that is the fulfillment of it. Yeah. So we've got another line of kings, the last kings of Israel then. The last kings of reign over here. And just like last time we had this quick succession of kings, we're going to see it gets wild up there. If God is not honored and worshipped, things get really, really wild. And I think if somebody maybe want to sit for a moment, you just count for us how many lines, family lines, have the Israelites seen up until the end of the reign. I haven't counted it up, but that'll be interesting. While this is one family line from David running all the way through, this one has been changed with all the assassinations of kings and families being destroyed. So Joash is on the throne in the south, and up in the north we had Jehu. Remember God's promise to him? 4 generations of your line will sit on the throne of Israel. Jehoahaz is the first of those then that come and sit, and he was disloyal to God. And he was severely oppressed, thank you, Lydia, severely oppressed by the Arameans. And at this time, remember the Arameans is Hazael, there on the right-hand side, the guy who assassinated Ben-Hadad. And it's a horrible oppression that they bring on them. A really atrocities being done. And in that, this disloyal man cries out to God for mercy. Says, please, Lord, please have mercy on me and my nation. And the Lord hears and answers and raises deliverance for them from that oppression. Really the grace of God. At the time that he cries out to God, they only had 50 horsemen, 10 chariots, and 10,000 foot soldiers. Think about that. The size of the army of that entire nation is depleted to 50 horsemen, 10 chariots, 10,000 foot soldiers. So it must have been an absolute miracle that they saw any deliverance at all. It was God working on their behalf, graciously pushing back the Arameans. After him then, Jehoash comes to the throne, and Elisha at his time is very ill already. He's lying on his deathbed. And the king comes in to see him. And it's incredible. He says to him, just the same as Elisha spoke to Elijah when he went up into heaven. He says, my Lord, the chariots and horsemen of Israel. In other words, he's ascribing to this prophet the power of the nation. He says, if it's not for you, what are we going to do? It's like the army has gone out of the country. He really recognizes God's anointing on him. And Jehoash then is told by Elisha, go stand at the window and take an arrow and shoot an arrow out towards the, when is it? Open the east window and shoot. So towards the east, shoot an arrow. And he stands and he shoots the arrow. He says, this is the arrow of victory over the Arameans. The Lord is going to use them to destroy them. And then he says, take a bunch of arrows in your hand and hit the ground. Now picture it. Elisha's lying on the bed giving these commands to the king. Strange things. He takes the arrows and he starts hitting the ground. 1, 2, 3, and he stands. He says, what? Only 3 times. Why didn't you not continue 5 times or 6 times hitting the ground? Because now you will only have 3 victories over the Arameans. If you hit 5 or 6 times, you have completely destroyed them. What's happened? What is happening in that? How does the prophetic word take shape with the actions of the king? Is it something to do with he's not a man of fervor? He doesn't obey fully. If you say jump, I say how high. I don't know. There must be some connection there. But then he had only 3 victories over the Arameans, and that's it. And the Arameans were not completely destroyed. They continued to be a pain for the Israelites. Very interesting stuff to think about. How does the spiritual and the physical work together with these things? So around that time then, let me just click through. Ben-Hadad comes to the throne, on his dad's throne, Hazael. And in the time of Jehoash then, with those victories over the Arameans, he recovers some of the key cities that were taken by Ben-Hadad before. But not the entire territory yet. And in that time then, Amaziah comes to the throne on his dad Joash's, following his dad Joash's assassination. And Amaziah had some victories over the Edomites. And after these victories with the Edomites, he's quite fired up and he sends a message to Jehoash and says, come meet me face to face in battle. To which Jehoash answers, hey, glory in your victory, but stay at home. In other words, don't pick a fight with me. And unfortunately, he did pick a fight with him and he lost badly. It cost him. So just another example of pride coming to a fall over there. Amaziah had David's heart, and he was after the Lord. But every time in one of these instances, we read that but the high places were never taken down. So many of these kings that had a good heart after God were not completely devoted. They didn't go out of their way to say, let's make sure that the land is cleansed of the idols that Solomon all those years back brought into the land. Remember, similar over here, Jeroboam brought it in, they're still worshipping it. Solomon brought it in on all the high places, it's still over there. It's not taken down yet. Then, following Jehoash, Jeroboam II comes to the throne in the south, and Jeroboam II is out and out evil. He did not love the Lord at all, did not have a good heart. But God is still gracious towards them. And just like he promised beforehand in the previous reign, he saw Israel suffering under the Arameans, and he gave them victory now, not just over the cities that they are conquering, but they actually take back all the territory that was back in the day belonging to Israel. And that is a fulfillment of the word that the Lord gave to Jonah. It's sort of like a by the way mentioning it. It's not in the book of Jonah. Jonah actually goes and speaks in the capital city of the Arameans, Nineveh. Remember? So when you go the story over here and you read Jonah again, you have lots of grace for him that he didn't want to go, that he wanted to see them destroyed. But this prophetic word he actually never heard, but we see the fulfillment of it. It just says, as Jonah prophesied, in his time, the territory of Israel was completely recovered again. So it seems like the country is going forward. There's going to be salvation. They're going to get back on their feet. But it's just territory at this stage. It's not heart. The people are actually not after the Lord. Then next comes, just a jump down, Zechariah. And in Zechariah's time, Uzziah is on the throne and Jotham is after him on the throne. I'll get to Zechariah just now, and Amos speaks in his time. But let's stop a moment with Uzziah. Some of your Bibles will say Azariah. So just a different translation of his name. Uzziah to me is one of the most interesting stories. And you actually have to go and read his story in Chronicles rather than the book of Kings. The book of Kings doesn't give us much detail about him. But in Chronicles, which only focuses on Judah, it never tells the story of Israel over here, it's Judah. It gives a lot of attention to him. And we find interesting stuff. He was a bit of an engineer, and he built catapults on the corners of the walls of Jerusalem that could fling lots of arrows at the same time or large stones at the enemy. Interesting stuff. And he had big building projects. In some instances, it sounds a little like Solomon. It's suddenly the land is just prospering and things are going well. He also has a really long reign. And it's got this beautiful phrase in it. I think it's chapter 26 of Chronicles. Where is it? Yeah, Chronicles 26. It says, his fame spread far and wide, for he was greatly helped until he became powerful. But when he became powerful, his heart got drawn away from the Lord. It's really sad. So he had a great reign up until then. Things were going really, really well. And he realized, I'm really famous. I'm really powerful. And his heart fell away from the Lord. And in that pride and presumption, one day he takes a censer and he decides, I don't just want to be king. You know what? I want to be priest as well. And these are two very different offices. They've got different roles to play. All right? The king does not burn incense in the temple. That's the priest's role. Very clearly from the book of Leviticus, that's how it will work. But he decided, no, I'm the bee's knees. So he takes the censer, walks into the temple, and the priests come walking towards him and says, what are you doing? What are you doing here? You're not supposed to do this. And he gets angry at them. And as he flings out at them in his anger, they jump back. And suddenly he realizes his face has turned leprous. In that instant, the Lord struck him with leprosy. Like Moses' sister, eh? And he left the temple and never went back to the palace. They brought him to a house where for the rest of his life he lived in confinement. And this is where the two kings' timelines in the book of Kings and Chronicles gets a bit confusing. Because the one assumes that Uzziah is still reigning because he hasn't died, but his son, Jotham, is acting as king on his behalf. So he's still calling the shots, even though he's confined in his own house. The other one assumes that, well, for all practical reasons, Jotham is now the king. So his reign has started off. And Uzziah's reign has ended because he's in confinement. And so the two doesn't match up. But it comes to exactly the same years. Either you're going to read it this way or that way. Jotham reigned longer and Uzziah shorter, or the other way around in the other book. But from that time on, he never, ever showed his face again outside a confined house. How sad. It's interesting then that Isaiah, exactly at that time, says in chapter 6, in the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord high and lifted up, and the train of his robe fills the temple. So the Lord is sitting on his throne where? In the temple. The prophet is saying there will be a day when there will be a king that rightfully sits in the temple reigning. And then Ezekiel has the same prophecy. Remember the prophecy about the river of life? Where does the river of life flow from? From the throne of God. Where is the throne of God? Right in the temple. So finally, in Jesus Christ, all of these offices meet perfectly. He is the prophet, he is the king, and he's also the priest. All of these things on our behalf. But quite miraculously, he's also the lamb sacrificed. All of it comes together in him. Truly, everything is fulfilled in Jesus Christ. And all of these things, in some or other way, is just an image of who he is on our behalf. It's glorious, eh? Yeah. So Zechariah comes to the throne, and he's as evil as his dad, Jeroboam. And he then is the last of these 4 kings on the line of Judah. Who do you have over here? Jotham and Zechariah. And after 6 months reigning, Shalom comes and assassinates him. And here we start again, that whole cycle of assassinations. Shalom reigns for only 1 month and then is assassinated by Manasseh, who was a really bloodthirsty tyrant. And in that time, same as we saw before, the word of Hosea comes as a warning. It says, "It was I who taught Ephraim to walk, taking them by the arms. How can I give you up, Ephraim? How can I hand you over, Israel?" Remember, Hosea has this prophetic action of taking a prostitute for a wife, and as she walks away, he goes and fetches her and brings her back, and brings her back. So the Lord is saying, listen, you've been running away, and I go and fetch you, and I bring you back. And now in the story, you can see all of that, right? You can see the prophets coming to speak. You can see the Lord aching, saying, bring you back. But why does the prophet say Ephraim? Why not Israel? Why not Samaria? Those images. Way back in the book of Genesis, when the sons are blessed at the end of the book of Genesis, the 12 sons of Jacob, it's interesting that Ephraim gets a similar word as Judah did. Something of royalty. You're going to reign. And Ephraim is then Jeroboam. The first king of the north is from Ephraim. And so it's always an image, just like Judah is seen as the royal house of the south. Even though it changes so many times over, Ephraim is spoken of in the prophets as the royal house of the north. Sort of like the main Canaan between all the other tribes, as a collective of them. And what a beautiful image over that. It always sounds to me like one of those that I hear the prophet crying on God's behalf when he says it. I took you like a boy, like that picture back there. I taught you how to walk, and then you walked away from me. Eh? It's such a sad image. Well, 10 years, Menahem is on the throne, and lots of blood is spilled by him. Pekahiah, his son, comes to the throne, and only after 2 years is assassinated. Pekah comes to the throne, similarly. He's the chief officer, actually, of Pekahiah. Again, it's somebody close to him. And after 2 years, Pekah is assassinated by Hoshea, who will be the last king. But in Pekah's reign already, Tiglath-Pileser from Assyria, and now for the first time we hear about Assyria. It's always been Aram that's been the strong one around, but now Assyria is the threat. Assyria then comes and starts taking them away. And so from Hoshea's time, the last king of the north, they really are he's a puppet king. He's just the governor on behalf of Assyria. And for 9 years, he lives that out. And I thought about that laughing picture of Hoshea over there, because it's sort of a nice position to be in. You're filling the space, the shoes, but you're not actually running the show. They're actually calling the shots. And I don't know how much care there was for the people in that time. So the Assyrians then come finally and spread them out all over the place. They take the Israelites and they spread them out all over their empire. And at that time, the Assyrians had a massive empire. They reigned over the Babylonian area right at the bottom of the Euphrates River as well. So it's far and wide. And their whole strategy was to break national spirit, to make sure that we get all the Israelites not together, because once they get together, they sort of feel like Israelites, and we want our land back, and we want our stuff, and we want our own king. But let's break them up into small little pockets and mix all the people around so that they become Assyrians. They become different. They have no nationality. And that's their strategy. So they also brought back into that whole Sumerian area of Israel people from all over the empire. And at that time, the book of Kings tells us, things got a bit rough for those people, because they started worshiping the God of Israel because we're on Israelite soil, but they didn't know the God of Israel. And so they mixed up all their own religions in this thing. And God sent lions into the land that started eating up the people. And then they said, well, we're in trouble. It's good that they recognize it. They said, please send us some priests who knows this God to teach us how to worship this God of the Israelites. And things changed, but not much. So even when Nehemiah later comes back, we then learn that the Samaritans have become a people with mixed religion. They sort of made up their own religion between all of these things. And even until the time of Jesus, they're seen as a different kind of people. They're no longer Jews, and they don't know God well. They know about him, but they don't quite understand it, who he is. So that's then the story of Israel, sadly to the end. In the meantime, though, in the south, I think I jumped a bit too early. On that page, we have Isaiah starting to prophesy to Uzziah and to Jotham. And we read that chapter 6 prophecy, but now chapter 7, they're at the bottom in the circle. The virgin is going to have a baby. She will give birth to a son, and he will be called Emmanuel. It's one of the most famous passages out of the book of Isaiah. But it's one of those that I think in the story we have to understand, because generally when we read Emmanuel, it's Emmanuel. God is with us. It's Jesus. So this is often read during Christmas time. But I don't even think it's a messianic prophecy. In the context, what's happening over there is the king on the throne at the time, Ahaz, is scared to bits because he's got two enemies that are giving him a hard time. The one is Rezin, and the other one is Pekah. It's two different rulers, the one from Aram and the one from Israel. And both of these enemies had it in for them at the same time, and he thought, man, I really need help. I really need help. And so the prophet comes with this prophetic word. And it's sort of like in the time of Elijah, where the word would say, hey, things are about to change. Don't worry. I've got this. The word then says, he will still be very young when he can decide between right and wrong. So there's a little boy that's going to grow up, and while he's still very young, even before then, the hands of the two kings you fear will be ruined. That is Rezin, king of Aram, and Pekah, king of Israel. So it's one of those prophecies that king could hang on and say, wait, let me just sit back and see what God's about to do. And sure enough, in a couple of years' time, Pekah wasn't there anymore. Hoshea was reigning. Aram wasn't even a world leader anymore. The Assyrians took over. Things have completely changed. His fears that he had at the time just flipped around. It's a different picture. So amazing. God is with us was a little boy round about that time. And the king could see, oh, it's all right. God is with us. Emmanuel. Now, when we flick over, we read about Ahaz, and it says, Ahaz sacrifices his son. So while we had Uzziah and we had Jotham, both of them earnestly seeking the Lord, at least Jotham throughout his reign, Isaiah shortly before the end of his reign, we've got this King Ahaz in between those guys and Hezekiah, who we all know as a very godly king. And Ahaz is absolutely the opposite, and for very political reasons. He had a problem with the Arameans, like that prophetic word said at the time. And to try and fix it, he sent a message with a lot of gifts up to Tiglath-Pileser. And he says, please, would you come on my behalf and sort out the Arameans for me? And the Assyrians agreed. And they came and they destroyed Damascus. They conquered the king at the time. And Ahaz went up to meet Tiglath-Pileser in Damascus. And when he came to Damascus, he saw a particular altar, an idol altar there. And he was really impressed with this thing. And it seems like the king of Assyria was also really impressed with this thing. And so he drew plans of this altar and sent it back to the priest back home in Jerusalem and said, make a copy of this altar. Make me an altar like this one. And the thing was made, and he said, now take this altar and put it right in the center stage of the temple where the other altar is, the bronze altar of the Lord. Just push that one sideways. And then on this altar, bring the morning and the evening sacrifice and all the sacrifices that would have been brought to God. Bring it now on this altar. In other words, don't bring it to God, bring it to an idol. This is not God's altar. Very interestingly, though, he adds, but keep the other altar, because I will inquire of God from that altar. Isn't it just such a powerful image of how we can often miss it? Why is he doing this? Because he wants to impress the king of Assyria. He wants to tell him, I'm worshiping like you do. See? It's a political move. I'm also sacrificing like your God does. That what you sacrifice there in Assyria, we the same. We do that. But on the sideline here, if I need advice, I'll go to God. All right. And so he did it, but unfortunately he did much more than that. Also in his time, he sacrificed his own son in the fire to Chemosh, to Molech, to all of those idols. So he completely withdrew from God. And God was really just like a sideline help if he would need him, possibly. At that time, Micah speaks up. He says, for her, Samaria's wound is incurable. It has come to Judah. So the same sins that they would have committed there up in the north is being committed now in the south, in Judah. It has reached the very gates of my people, even to Jerusalem itself. It's like a forepointing to saying, so what's going to happen to Judah? If that's the road that they walked, what's going to happen over here? And now we come to Hezekiah, and I think it's one of the better known stories. Just check that at the top of your manual. This particular story, the next 4 chapters, or 3 chapters, in the book of Kings, is repeated word for word in the book of Isaiah. All 3 of those chapters. And I always say, it's interesting that I can read it here in Kings, and it reads in a particular way. It reads like history. If I read it in the book of Isaiah, It's exactly word for word the same, but the context of the book of Isaiah is prophetic words. And suddenly the color of these stories sound very different. It really is different. And then again, we get it in the book of Chronicles, not in all of the detail that we see it here, but the story is retold again. So it's somewhat like the gospel, given to us 4 times in 4 different accounts by 4 different people. It's interesting that these particular stories of Hezekiah is repeated 3 times in the Old Testament for us. I think there's reason for it. It really is powerful stories that we should heed. So what happened? Sennacherib is now king of Assyria, and he's got a mighty, mighty, mighty kingdom. The kingdom has advanced greatly. And he was chief commander, actually, under the previous king of Assyria, and has now come to the throne. So he's a really powerful guy, really powerful. And he's also extremely proud and arrogant. And Sennacherib, it seems that throughout these war affairs, have learned how to work with manipulation and fear. And he uses it very well. Not well as in good, because there's no good about it. But he knows how to play this game. He knows how to defeat an enemy in the spirit before he takes him on physically. And so he sends his Assyrian chief officer and field commander to Jerusalem. And he sends them with very particular messages. So Jerusalem is tightly shut, and inside the city is Hezekiah and the rest of the people. And these 2 guys come outside the gate, and Hezekiah sends out Eliakim, his palace administrator, and Shebna, his secretary, to go and speak to them, to hear what terms of peace there may be. The field commander then clearly tells them, listen, do not trust your God. Do not think that he's going to save you. Have any of the other gods saved them? Any of these other cities that he's destroyed and countries that we took over, has any of their gods ever saved them? Do not trust in your God. Just don't. He's not going to do anything for you. And then he starts calling out to the people on the wall in their own language, Aramaic. And Shebna and the Eliezer says, please, 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 don't speak in that language in the hearing of the people. We understand your language. Speak to us. And then he very purposefully shouts out loud. He says, shouldn't I speak to them as well? Because these people will all eat their own feces and drink their own urine before we finish with you. And everybody in the city would have, what's going to happen to us? Fear wants to come into the city. This guy's just playing the game. And then he sends a message off to Hezekiah. He says, do not listen to Hezekiah, for he is misleading you. And he says, your God's going to save you. And with that, they go in. They say to Hezekiah, this is what the man is saying. And Hezekiah goes into the temple of God, makes the right move. He goes and humbles himself before the Lord, and he sends these 2 guys off, and he says, go to Isaiah's house and tell him to intercede for us, that God may have mercy on us. He goes to God and he says, God, listen to what this man is saying. Listen to how he is mocking you, and he's making a mockery out of us. And a message comes back from Isaiah. I want to read it for you word for word. I think it's just so beautiful, because it's actually God's own words. This is the word that the Lord has spoken against him. He says, do not listen to the, where have I got it now? I'm in the wrong chapter. It says, do not listen to those words that the underlings of Assyria has come to say. I will send a message to him, and he will turn around in his own feet and run back home. Just love how the Lord addresses them. The underlings, these are the most powerful guys on the face of the earth at the moment. They've made war and they've got victory wherever they turn. The underlings of Assyria. Don't listen to them. And so, that same day, there comes a message that the king Sennacherib has made war with Libnah, a different place. And it comes to the field commander, and he breaks up his army, and he turns around to go and help the king. And on his way back, he sends a letter to King Hezekiah. And it says, do not think that your God is saving you. We will be back, and we will come and victoriously come and reign over you. And Hezekiah responds the same way. He takes the letter sent to him, and he goes into the temple, and he lays it down on the ground. He says, God, look at what this man is saying. You deal with him. And then again, I've got the right place now to read for you. God says this. Virgin daughter Zion despises you and mocks you. It's a prophetic word. Daughter Jerusalem tosses her hair as you flee. Isn't it a beautiful picture? As opposed to this powerful army and these guys, yes, bad mouthing and everything, God is referring to the virgin daughter of himself. This is my Judah. And my Judah just looks at you and goes, happy running. Who is it you have ridiculed and blasphemed? Against who have you raised your voice and lifted your eyes in pride? Against the Holy One of Israel. God says, all that guy is saying, I take it very personally. He's not speaking about you, my virgin daughter. He's speaking about me, and I will fight him. And the whole way that Hezekiah has gone about this is absolutely spot on right. Every time he says, I hear this, God, do you hear this? What's your reply? He's written this, God, can you read this? What's your reply? And the God speaks on his behalf. Eventually, Sennacherib gets back to Nineveh, to his own capital city, and he goes back into the temple of his own God up there. And in his own temple, his own son assassinates him in the presence of his God. How's that for a close of the story? Eh? Do not trust in your God, Jerusalem. He cannot save you from me. Well, I should not trust my own God, because even in his own temple, he cannot save me from my own son. Eh? Such a twist to the story. Sadly, though, those chapters have two more stories of Hezekiah. The one is wonderful, the other one is very terrible. Hezekiah is sick on his bed, and Isaiah is sent to him to say, put your house into the order, you're about to die. And when Isaiah, after delivering his message, come out of the king's chamber, Hezekiah turns his head towards the wall and weeps and pleads with God for his life and say, please, Lord, lengthen my life. And Isaiah is about to leave the palace, and at the gate, the Lord says to him, turn around, go back to Hezekiah, because I've seen him plead for his life. And he comes back into the chamber and he says, I've got another message for you, Hezekiah. The Lord says, I have heard your prayer and seen your tears, and I will heal you. I will give you another 15 years added to your life. And now Hezekiah is a bit confused. He said, but I've just heard that I'm about to die, and now say I'm about to be healed. What's it going to be? Give me a sign. Give me some proof that I will know that what you've said, I will be healed, that it is true. And so Isaiah asked him, well, ask what sign you want. Do you want the sundial to move forward 3 hours, or do you want it to move back 3 hours? They've actually looked out the window to the steps of the palace at the shadow. And so he reasons, well, the sun is going to move forward anyway, so move it back, and then I'll know. And remember, what is it all about? Will what God says happen, or will it not? God could have just said, well, wait and see if you get up off your bed. As easy as that. But what is at stake here is the man's peace of heart. He's just sick on his bed, and all that God, through all of this, is willing to do for him is to give him peace, give him assurance. Says, I will heal you. Rest assured. That's all that's at stake. The prophetic word of the healing is already spoken, and it's going to come true because God does not lie. And just to give him assurance, God was willing to do that, to make the sun move back backwards. And then the day continued. How phenomenal is that? That God would literally shift the earth to bring peace to his son's heart. Incredible. And that actually then results in the start of the next story. Because the Babylonians, all of the ages, have been astrologers. They're the wise men from the east that came to check out the star, right? And so they saw, what just happened? We had a 6-hour longer day, right? What? And somehow the word came, it's got something to do with the king of Judah, something to do with King Hezekiah. And these guys travel all the way from Babylonia, and they come and inquire, what happened? What was all this about? And while they're there, Hezekiah, in his pride, probably feeling really important, the universe has just shifted around me. Yes. Not the whole universe, literally. It's just the earth. Eh? But he's prideful and arrogant at this stage, and he shows these envoys from Babylon all the treasures of the palace, takes them into the temple, shows them all the riches and the glory of the temple. And then they leave, they go back home. And as they go back home, Isaiah comes and he says, what did you show these men from Babylon? He said, well, I showed them all my treasures, palace, temple, everything. And he says, they will come, and everything that they've seen, they will take away. And in a couple of generations' time, that will happen. But added to the word, he says, but not in your time, it'll be in the time of your children to come. To which Hezekiah replied, well, at least it's not going to be in my days. Now remember when he was sick on his bed, and it was his life at stake, his life, not his children's life. What was he willing to do? Plead with God. And God answered and graciously said, I will extend your life. And to give him peace, he shifted the earth. And now, when his life is not at stake, his comfort is not at stake, his wealth is not at stake, he says, all right, well, that's okay. What if he pleaded? Eh? What if he pulled an Ahab? He says, God, please have grace and mercy. Eh? I think the story would have been very different. And then we get to his son's life, a son that was born in those last 15 years of his reign. Manasseh is 12 years old when he comes to the throne. And interestingly, he's the longest reigning king of both Israel and Judah. The words simply tell us there has never been such a horrible king as Manasseh. In fact, I've got some details there. And there's two faces of him because he's the man who turns around 180 completely from evil to good. He rebuilt the high places his father Hezekiah had demolished. He also erected altars to the Baals and made Asherah poles. He bowed down to all the starry host and worshipped them. He built altars in the temples of the Lord, of which the Lord had said, my name will remain in Jerusalem forever. In both courts of the temple of the Lord, he built altars to all of the starry host. He sacrificed his children in the fire in the valley of Ben Hinnom. Practiced divination and witchcraft, sought omens, and consulted mediums and spiritists. He did much evil in the eyes of the Lord, arousing his anger. Moreover, Manasseh also shed so much innocent blood that he filled Jerusalem from end to end. Besides the sin that he had caused Judah to commit, so that they did evil in the eyes of the Lord. It's interesting. I wonder if a son from Hezekiah came to the throne before those 15 years. How would the succession have been? But Manasseh had a very different dad from his other brothers in those prideful years. And then it says there in 2 Corinthians 33, the Lord spoke to Manasseh and his people, but they paid no attention. So the Lord brought against them the army commanders of the king of Assyria, who took Manasseh prisoner, put a hook in his nose, bound him with bronze shackles, and took him to Babylon. In his distress, he sought the favor of the Lord his God and humbled himself greatly before the God of his ancestors. What would you have done? Praise God, he's not like us, eh? And when he prayed to him, the Lord was moved by his entreaty and listened to his plea. So he brought him back to Jerusalem and to his kingdom. Then Manasseh knew that the Lord is God. He got rid of the foreign gods and removed the image from the temple of the Lord, as well as all the altars he had built on the temple hill and in Jerusalem. He threw them out of the city. Then he restored the altar of the Lord and sacrificed fellowship offerings and thanks offerings on it, and told Judah to serve the Lord, the God of Israel. The people, however, continued to sacrifice at the high places, but only to the Lord, their God. There was a true revival in the land, because one man turned from complete evil to complete good. What's interesting, though, is similar to that incident with David and Bathsheba, where there's repentance and there's real forgiveness from the Lord, there's still consequences. So in the prophets like Jeremiah, it actually says so in Kings as well, I will make them abhorrent, that's Judah, to all the kingdoms of the earth because of what Manasseh, son of Hezekiah, king of Judah, did in Jerusalem. In Kings particularly, it says, because of all the innocent blood that he shed in the land, finally they were taken out of the land. So the consequences of Manasseh's action is directly then the exile into Babylon. And it's not just his actions, but it's pointed back to, because of what Manasseh did, because of these things that he did, they will no longer be in the land. It's come to an end. But how glorious that God would be so gracious to a man that was so absolutely thrown to evil. It just stirs hope in our hearts to anybody that we may meet, eh? And to ourselves. That God, thank you for your grace. Thank you for your grace, Father God. There's nobody, surely nobody beyond salvation. Eh? Yeah. Let's take a quick 5-minute break. And this will be our last break before we come back and we finish off with the book of 2 Kings.